Okay, next let's you want to look a little bit at how one actually writes a CBPR proposal. And this is very much the third assignment. So in the CBPR approach, as we've explored and looked at it, is obviously much more flexible and much more open to change and development over time. But if we want to incorporate it as part of science and part of the development of thinking, it does still require rigor in terms of thinking, etc. And this rigor needs to be reflected in the protocol and how you write up and plan your research. And it is using a systematic approach and doing regular reflection that makes it research. As against the alternative approach is a kind of community action political approach. What turns it into a research approach is the rigor and the systematic application of tools and the consistent reflection on the process. That is what turns it from being community action into research. And both have their roles, but we are talking more about the research as a research process. And the proposal should guide operations in the field. It should set out what you're going to do, set out the parameters of your research, and guide within that should then guide the operation of what you want to do in the field. And so from a proposal, another person should be able to pick that up and run something similar. And it's really your measure of a proposal. It's that somebody who picks it up should be able to read, understand, and be able to work with that idea. Obviously implicit within CBPR is being reflected to community needs and context. And the context is not something that you try and control for, as in, say, a randomized control trial or a cohort study. Your context is something that is implicit and is essential to the process, essential to CBPR. So a fundamental in each proposal is a clear and developing narrative that flows through the opening statement or research question right through. That is just my way of thinking about research, is that the research needs to have this fundamental flow. And so once you set your research question, set your context, your research question, your aims and objectives should flow from that. Your research method should be directed at answering those aims and objectives. And that is the measure by which you judge your research methods. Are they able to answer these questions, and are they answering additional questions? If so, what's wrong with your aims and objectives? Or is this peripheral for some side interest? And then again, through your analysis. Remember, you're still writing a research proposal, so you need your background and research question. You need to set your aims and your objectives, your research design, how you're going to draw your sample, who your sample is, what your sampling frame is, your instruments, your analysis, and your ethics. Okay, so as I said earlier, the proposal must constitute a continuous flow. The literature for you must be directed at a question, not just a build-up of as many references as possible. And that's often a student error, is to try to, and something I did for years, almost up to my PhD, is just thinking you need to pull in as many references as possible. And the more references you have, the better your literature review. It's not the case. It's anything there must be relevant and directed at the question. The aims and objectives must flow from this. You can have sub-aims and objectives in the study that are related areas that you want to investigate, but they must somehow relate to the core issues. And then the sample and instruments must reflect those aims and objectives. And that's really, again, is your measure of your research question, of your research, of your survey instruments and your discussion schedules. If there are questions and instruments not in aims and objectives, you need to keep going back. And that is a constant reflexive process. Very often you'll find a very neat aims and objectives, but then you get to your research, your survey or your discussion schedule, and you'll discover that the additional things being added that are really valid and of importance. And you have to go back and disrupt your very neat aims and objectives and make them somewhat untidy. And untidiness is part of CBPR, so you learn to live with that. There's also this fieldwork staffing and training and operational procedures. Right? Now these are often additional documents. You don't necessarily put your operational procedures in your fieldwork staffing and training, but those are additional documents that you need to bear in mind in your development. Now, obviously, this would be the stats. This is what I spoke about is the standard research proposal that one would use for any study that one is doing in the field, and you could apply to a randomized controlled trial, to a qualitative exercise, to qualitative research, to even laboratory research. Yeah, I'm getting a bit of a disco show from there. Obviously within CBPR there are specific challenges. And one challenge is drawing in the community participation. How does one draw in the community participation? How do they participate in the writing of? And it depends a lot on who your participants are. If you're working with an informal settlement or people with low education, it's much harder to draw them into formal writing, but you do need to do that, and I'll talk a lot more about that as we go through the lecture. The other thing is, when do you write the proposal? And I'll talk later about the likelihood of having multiple proposals in CBPR. Because you might have a proposal, as Kiara is talking about now, when you enter, feel about how you recruit and draw people in to your study and establish the CBPR process. But then within it, there might be, even that, you might go in with a set of ideas, and on your first or second consultation, you've got to tear a lot of that up and rework it, because suddenly the community manifests in a very different way to what you expected. And there might be groups that you are not aware of. There might be power bases that you thought operated in a particular way that don't. There might be different understanding. Yeah, so it's when to actually write this proposal. And part of my gut is that it's something that is a constant exercise in rewriting and reworking. But we'll come back to that and the difficulty, particularly in terms of ethical clearance and funded clearances. Doing exercises on the spur of the moment. You're sitting in a workshop and things are not working. You might need to introduce an exercise that you hadn't incorporated in your formal proposal. Yeah, something like a SWOT exercise or fishes and boulders or whatever. There's this across the lectures that were given in the last block and those references that you have. There are masses of these kinds of exercises that one uses to collect information and to break down barriers and to develop understandings on the spur of the moment. There are different levels of methodology that need to be taken into account. So you might plan a more formal process of workshops to gradually develop, and that might flow quite smoothly. But within that, there are these exercises, as I spoke about. You might have a notion of doing a survey, but within that, you might find subpopulations that you need to do separate, smaller exercises with. So there are multiple layers of methodology that one has to take into account. And some of it in your design might say that you will try and use some of these exercises in these phases to break down barriers and to make connections with community members. And then there's obviously the issue of getting ethical approval and ongoing coverage. And how does one manage this kind of situation where where your processes and what you're doing changes? And what does that mean in terms of your ongoing ethical coverage? Okay, suggested outline for CBPR. And this will depend on the stage of connection, whether external funding has specific requirements in terms of content. So, what I'm talking about here is there's a range of different proposals that can be written in CBPR, as I said, from initial proposal for how you access your community and start working with your community, to as a community raises specific points. So if we're working in Delft, it might be the first proposal might be around how to understand access and set up relationships, set up the CBPR process. And once you're in the field, they may raise two issues. Dealing with levels of substance abuse in the community and dealing with diarrhea in under 5 children. Now these are two completely separate proposals, and you'd have to write two proposals, one for each of those. So what you're talking about is, so that is one thing in terms of your stage of connection, where you are with the community, what is going on. Then there's also the thing of external funding. If you are being funded by an external source, and we didn't get the funding, but we applied for an EU grant to do work on diarrhea under 5 and to use a CBPR approach, in which case we'd be entering the community with a specific mandate from our external funders to do work using community consultation and process, but the content had to be specific on under 5 diarrhea. So which also sets limitations and sets a basis for both how you do your access negotiation and talking, but also what your content is. You can have a fairly open approach, but you need to, again, set some limitation. And those you need to decide for yourself. What kinds of action are you... And bear in mind that, and I'll talk about this, it didn't really come up in the second block. If you go back to our first block, CBPR, action research, and the notion of praxis and action are two of the key legs of CBPR. So it's not just proposals around development of research and finding out information. It's also proposals around development of action. And action is a fundamental part of CBPR. And it's often an area that's less spoken about. So as I said, the proposal develops over time, multiple proposals for different stages of the project. So you might at a later stage come back with, as I said, the proposal around how to address issues of substance abuse, how to address issues around diarrhea under 5 children. Then as it goes ahead, you might then develop further proposals. Your initial phase of investigation into substance abuse might lead to consideration of, I think it would very rapidly identify alcohol, tick and heroin as the core issues. You then, okay, so what are you starting to do for your next proposal? How to investigate, what kind of action is possible, what the limitations are around action, etc. And talk about the workshops. And what you can do very often just around the issue of the brief workshops, brief exercises, one can talk about workshops that incorporate specific CBPR approaches. And mixed methods is very often a good approach for CBPR. One thing that is important is to incorporate community language, particularly when you're developing these second stage proposals around specific issues. Community members will then be part of the drawing up of the proposals by that stage. So you need to start to find this balance between community language and academic language. You might need different components to respond to community needs and researcher technical requirements, researcher needs or technical requirements if necessary. So if one's dealing, we need to remember that we are also part of this process, and we will be wanting to maybe publish some of the data coming from this, and some of it can be published as a CBPR process. But there might also be interesting prevalence issues, issues around causation or contributing factors. And you want to make sure that this is covered in the proposal. And these are compromises that you make with the community members, that they get their issues covered, but you also have some of your issues and concerns and interests covered. So this might need to be balanced out within a proposal, so as to make sure that some of those issues are addressed. But whatever you put in, this needs to at some level be made understandable to the community members. So I'm not, I sat last night reading a paper which had some really complex path analysis on it that I didn't really understand or follow. Admittedly, I wasn't in the best frame of mind for reading it. So one's very be careful. You can't take community members through complex model building and path analysis. The statistical, very sophisticated statistical tools. But one can talk about, this is what you're hoping to do with these tools, and this is why it is important. So the community mustn't be shocked if some things are starting to happen at one or another point. So I'm not saying that you have to train community members basically in logistical analysis and factor analysis, but people need to be aware of what is going on and understand the importance and role of it. You need to be aware of the audience. So in some cases it will be a scientific audience, in other cases a community audience. And you may need different versions of the proposal for community members, for funders, for academic institutions, and for your ethics board. The ethics board will probably should want to see all of the versions, but the community, particularly, there's also community in community when we're working, because you'll be working with a research board or research group. Very often when you go in and start working in the community, you can't work with 20,000 people or 50,000 or even 1,000 people that constitute your community. You'll work on a more active basis with a smaller group of representatives. And they might see a more sophisticated version. But as you go, if you want to take this research out into the community and have them look at them and respond, you might want to send a one-page summary of the proposal out on a more general basis. I remember from our PhD research, we wanted to go and do work in one of an informal settlement in one section of the community. And we I did a one-page pamphlet with one side being a letter of support from the civic, and the other side being a very brief summary of what we wanted to do, and this is District 1 that put under every single door in this informal settlement. So that when the field workers went in, they were met and the process was understood. So this is again something that is another version of the process that needs to be incorporated when you're doing the work in the community. As I said earlier, one of your first proposals is very often about establishing a relationship, about establishing this connection, establishing the CBPR approach. And then the others get onto the more key or related issues. Okay, I'm going to go through the different components of the proposal. The structure and components will vary by nature and stage of CBPR process. The lecture will focus on the study being written once. Okay. Okay, so how these structures and how the different components are written up will vary. So it's a difficult process and a little bit to present, but I'll try and give examples of different kinds of proposals as we go through. The lecture will focus on a study being written once a good set will focus rather on most examples will focus on a study once a good community relation has already been developed, rather than being on the process of developing the relationship. So in this case, a research question has been established by discussion between community and researchers. Some methods have been discussed. And proposal writing may be a stage in the process which goes back to workshops and community discussions as well as discussions in an academic institution. Okay. So your background and research question. The first issue is the background to a community. So I'm going to work with the example of those two examples I spoke about in Delft. So the first is you talk a little bit about what Delft is as a community, then the introduction to community members are participating in part of the team. So you would start then also to talk about the CBPR process and how you drew this team together, how this grouping is operating. So essentially setting up a discussion of your research team. And this provides an introduction to the methodological approach. And it's also used to include this for broader concern as it starts to address some of the different assumptions about because it depends on who you've incorporated into this team as to what is prioritized, how it is prioritized. And then you start to talk about some of the introductions to the concerns being expressed. So you're starting now to establish your context is the community and your context is the group that you're working with. And then you start to say, well, one of the issues that arose was how to deal with substance abuse in this community, on the substance abuse in the community. Within CBPR, less emphasis is usually put in the community profiles and literature reviews. But since writing this, I've been questioning it more and more, and you can see, yeah. And I think it is still, certainly for the researcher side and for the academic side of your work, you still need to do the literature reviews. But these might also be important for the community members, so they can understand, when certain things were done in, say, Durban or Port Elizabeth or Sao Paulo or Los Angeles, these were some of the responses that happened. And it starts to empower communities with that kind of knowledge that they can then start to understand issues. Start to understand that they feel less isolated. They're not the only people in the world suffering these problems. If I work, say, in the community of Delft, people are very aware that Khayelitsha, Elsie's River, Manenberg, all of these communities have similar substance abuse issues. And they know that many of the people have moved between communities, and so they're familiar with the issues. They might go to school in a different community. So they're aware of these issues, but they might not be aware of just in what extent Cape Town is different from Johannesburg. In Johannesburg, tick is much less of an issue. Unga or heroin is much more of an issue. Alcohol is a much bigger issue in some communities. And just giving some kind of history to the process. Just to what an extent the alcohol abuse in South Africa is drawn on the historical system of the DOP system, or history of the DOP system. Might be quite useful for community members to know. And they might find interventions and solutions from other sites useful. This might become part of the reflective process. Yeah, just the notions of training, using families to support systems for substance abusers, having how other communities, as a way of addressing substance abuse, another community might have had enhanced hand washing systems and education around proper hand washing before meals and how that served to reduce diarrhea. How the boiling of water served to reduce diarrhea in another community. And maybe they need to, so water in Cape Town tends to be better than water in most other countries in the world. But it might be that in a place like, that at times water does become more problematic and the need to test the water, etc., to continually test water quality. All of this literature starts to set for yourself, but also for community members, set out some of the research question and context. Again, while all literature is relevant, the focus will be on community-based reports, and the context behind the studies also needs to be considered. So you'll work a lot with CBPR kind of studies, but anything that reflects on the context and on interventions that have been developed. And remember, this is integral to CBPR, is that CBPR is intervention-based work. So you need to be constantly looking at that in terms of the literature reviews as well. And what interventions that might have been quite centrally done could be adapted to community-based. Yes, and the other thing I do like to talk about is having a narrative feel to a proposal. The proposal must tell you a story about an issue in the community and a study. So you start with the context of the community and the context of the problem. Then take your reader through a gradual distilling of that problem for the research study, through the aims and objectives, into the methods and analysis. And everything has to reflect on one another. It's like trying to read a book and suddenly discovering in chapter 50 that they suddenly introduced a key character that didn't appear anywhere else before and completely skews the story. Or where they've obviously fabricated parts of the story early on and they changed later on. Destroyed a novel that I was reading recently where it was so obviously they were trying to manipulate the reader that it just became weak. So as in any story, the narrative is important. Okay, so you've got your research question. In this case, we'll be looking at two research questions. The issue of substance abuse and issue of under 5 diarrhea. So you're trying to address these issues. Now you need to be very clear. So these are the research questions. How do you address these problems in the community? So you need to be very clear about what information you want to seek. And it could be very broad at this point. Diarrhea, what are the contributing factors in this community to diarrhea? What are the issues that put our children at risk? That could be your very broad aim. The same thing is why is substance abuse such a big issue in this community? So that's, your aims are traditionally fairly broad. Now I know that, sorry, just for the record, I know that different research textbooks have different understandings and different courses have different understandings how you separate research question, aims and objectives. I talk about in this structure, and you'll have to just accept it for this course, of a gradual distilling, where your research question is your broad area. Your aim is distilling what you want to know about that. So your research question is, in this case, diarrhea and under fires is a problem in this community. Why? Substance abuse is a problem in this community. Why? Your aim would be to understand what directly contributes towards diarrhea in this community. What puts the children at risk. In substance abuse, what is it about this community that increases substance abuse, and what are the factors around the distribution? You'll then start to set your objectives. And your objectives then take it, well, your role of the objectives for me is to set out very clearly exactly what kind of information you're looking for. So if one looks at, say, diarrhea, you might want to know what are the particular risk exposures that children might face in this community? What are the protective factors that could be used, and what inhibits them being applied? And then maybe what kinds of action are feasible around these issues? What of these risks and what of these potential interventions are more directly actionable in terms of intervention? And then around substance abuse, it might be, what is the actual use of alcohol and other drugs in this community? Why are people using these drugs or these substances? What are the reported reasons? And how are these substances being distributed? And what kinds of actions can be taken around this? With the latter, one might try to, substance abuse might take a more restricted form of intervention. You might not be interested in the levels and history or causes of it. You might really want to know just how are these substances being distributed and what kind of actions can be taken to reduce the distribution. It's often a fairly restrictive one, so we won't go with that. But you've got to. It essentially comes back to where do you and the community see as being the process. The same within diarrhea. It might go around, well, what can we do? What is the extent of open defecation or soiling in the community, and what can be done to improve toilets and sanitation? But really what you need to do with your objectives is set something that you can then develop your methodology around. These are the questions that you want to answer. And if you want to answer these questions, what information do you need? That's what your objectives are there to do, is to tell you for your next step, exactly what information do you need when you're going out into the field. And particularly these objectives should dominantly reflect the community needs, and this is really where the community stuff comes in. There's information that you're looking to cover for fund or publication needs. You need to negotiate this very clearly at this point with the community and add it into the objectives. And these need to be accepted by the community research teams. You can't railroad a process through. You should not necessarily put limits on what you could find out about the subject. And the aims and objectives shouldn't block lateral thinking, because as you go in, as I spoke about earlier with the blind spots that exist around community members and with you as a researcher, you might quite rapidly find out that there's something else going on. Now, it might be the issue of you assuming the toilets are constantly in a bad condition, and therefore people, and we saw this from earlier study, I think I mentioned it, people were then taking to defecating in the bush or in a pathway that a lot of children played and walked through. So the action might be in anger at the city council for not repairing doing the toilets, but a bit of investigation might show that some of the local kids are playing tricks and are regularly sabotaging the toilets. So the issue is more to bring those kids into discipline and bring them more into line, and then the toilets will work more effectively. And that will then reduce the other knock-on implications of having to defecate in the bushes. At the same time, it might be not just be a case of reducing the distribution, it might be a case of making sure that one or two corrupt cops are removed from the force so that effective policing can happen. And that might of its own reduce distribution. So these are kinds of things, so when you go in, because it's this kind of approach that's fairly open, you need to make sure that you're open to new ideas emerging, new approaches emerging, because those can change. But dominantly, the aims and objectives set the direction for your work. And then as you enter the field, you might find issues that need to be adapted. So if you found out this issue around the kids that are regularly blocking the toilets or creating problems in the toilets, then you need to start finding. And one of the problems with the new houses that have been built, the toilets are regularly being blocked up. And it was assumed to be a problem with the toilets. But what emerged was that there was no adequate refuse disposal. So all refuse has been disposed of through the flush toilets, which inevitably meant that all the flush toilets were regularly being blocked. And that is why there were problems emerging. So the solution there might not be to provide better toilets, but to provide better refuse collection. So you do, when you're working in CBPR, you're constantly keeping this open mind and looking at issues that will contribute. Regularly adaptations might be adding new objectives. It might be resolving some objectives very early on and introducing new things. It might be adapting how you see them. But they should generally continue to fit into your research question. So it's the issue of, to take that last example of the refuse removal, one would then focus on the refuse. One then doesn't necessarily mean one then starts focusing your study on the refuse collection. You still try and keep it on the derail issue, but you make that as an additional intervention, or you introduce a new portion to the study. But you try. But what also might happen is that, the example of the youth, it's quite a different thing to start then emphasizing, well, one needs to find other things for the young boys to do in these communities so they're not just creating havoc. That's an entirely new study to find ways of keeping boys off the streets, or girls. For all intents, no, it's attached more primarily to boys. Remember, you've got to keep the community teams with you in terms of adaptation of these aims, but without boring them through an endless pedantic research process. I know endless pedantic research process can bore the life out of me. It can do more to communities. Research design. You need to put in a brief description of what you want to do, including a basic methodology and some of the specifics about the context of the work. You might also include more details on some of the broader specific issues that you want to look at within the broader aims. Okay. So in this case, you might start to say, okay, we want to do survey work around and going to a number of households, talking about access to toilets, how many people are that use each. So if it's an informal settlement and there's one toilet for 4 shacks, which is a kind of normal distribution. How many people are using this? How often in the month is this toilet broken down? If it is broken down, where do they go to? This would be kind of survey questions. You might also want to do some tests of the water. So that would be an additional methodology. You might want to do some observational research looking at a number of, like map out an area in the bush or on a pathway and map out the level of fecal content in that area. That's another methodology. You might want to do interviews or focus groups with a number of households or individuals just to get their feelings and sense of the issue and when processes are. And you also, if you're doing the research in summer, you might want to find out, well, what is the difference in this happens in winter? What are the seasonal variations? You might not be able to do the study over a year. So you can then get their reflections of how this is better or worse in winter. So you'll set these out as broad areas of methodology that you want to do. Yeah, and then there are, of course, also the community-specific CBPR methods, such as the community mapping, asset mapping, risk mapping, etc. It might come in useful with both the diarrheal work and the substance abuse. With the mapping, you might want to take a community and map where the shebeens are, map where the drug dealers are, map where people smoke. People do also go to smoke tick. And it starts to give you a graphical sense of the community, how these distribute, their relation to other protections or providers. And if one's starting to then look at asset mapping, you might start to also look at alternative activities for youth and where these are, how these are mapped in the community as kinds of assets that might balance against the threats of the drug users, drug sellers. So depending on, now there'll be some levels of detail on these methods as well. Obviously a lot of the details are reserved for the instrumentation example. This serves to set the framework for the technical components that follow. Remember, this needs to be functional for all users. It needs to be functional for the community members, for the institution, for funders, and for ethics. And this, as I said before, this can either be in one unit or in multiple units. As I said before, so this might have to remain open to change and development. If early on, if you're doing the research in the Cape winter, you might have a sudden thunderstorm or rainstorm and all the fecal content is washed away, in which case that methodology has to be put on hold for a period of time. It might be that as you get going into the field work, you're starting, as you get going with the survey, additional questions might emerge and then you have to adapt. And with the use of specific CBPR techniques, these might adapt over time as well. And as you add them, so you may talk about workshops. Within the workshops, you might use something such as a spot, fishes and boulders, and use of stickies. All of these tend to be workshop techniques. You won't necessarily specify all of them, but one can say that we will run workshops, and in the workshops we may or may not use these techniques based on the value of them at the time. There's some specific techniques such as the asset and risk mapping, photo voice, or positive deviance that are more structured and larger approaches. And there these might need to be described in more detail. If we go back to the lecture that Nicola did, now one of the ways of addressing ethical issues in CBPR is to talk about the options that might be used and provide that, particularly for ethical committees or for funders who often aren't familiar with some of these techniques, is to describe them in some detail so people are aware. Okay, the sample here, key information is the sample in frame. So who you're going to be drawing the sample from. So if you're working in, say, the Darrell sample, you might be most interested in a particular informal settlement, in which case your sampling frame would be in Delft, would be, say, the Tsunami and Blikkiesdorp communities. And these constitute about 5,000 shacks in each. That's a guesstimate picture. And within that, if you're working within, and you might have multiple sampling frames. So if you're working within the substance abuse, you might be interested particularly in surveying youth in the community. So for the survey, the sampling frame might be the youth in the community, but for the reviews, for the mapping, or for the description of venues, you might be interested in the shebeens. So your sampling frame is all the shebeens and taverns in the community. Then the sample size you're aiming for, so some preset idea. And this is it's often still useful to have an idea, and very often you won't be able to, it's more difficult to implement the kinds of power analyses that one would talk about in a more sophisticated statistical study to set your sample size. But you will need some specified idea, so you might want to go to, out of the 10,000 shacks in these communities, you might want to go to, say, 100 or 200 in each to draw a survey. Or you might want to talk to 100 youth or 20 venues across the community. Then the system that you'll use for sampling. Systematic sampling, random sampling, convenience sampling, purpose of sampling, all of these are options for CBPR. So, often an easy thing with you, most informal settlements are dwellings are numbered from 1 to however many there are. So what we used to do is you'd go to, say, you could go to every 10th one, or if you're looking at 100 out of a group of 5,000, let's go to every 50th, go to every shack that ends in 05, 06, and 56. So it's just a way of defining how you're going to select the sample. And just because you work in CBPR doesn't mean you need to drop, doesn't mean you have to drop constructions such as sampling systems. And just a matter of working through why these kinds of sampling systems are important with your community committee. And I know from another study I did years ago in community committee, they didn't necessarily grasp all the reasons and motivations, but they were very happy to cooperate. And obviously the more understanding you can get, the more likely you are to get really good quality and to get better buy-in. Within the shebeens, you might want to, because you're working with a much smaller sample, you might want to take a more purposive sample. So they might select, say, 3 or 5 legal taverns in the community. and divide those between big ones in the center and small ones, and say 15 shebeens, where you might want, and those might, in Delft, you might want to get some that are African and some that are coloured, or get a spread across communities, across geographical sections of the community. So there are ways of looking at the sampling. I'm not going to go through all the sampling approaches. I'm assuming that people have some basic knowledge of this. With those approaches, you need to describe how you will do that. Then how you will find and recruit the sample. How you'll go out and how the field workers will go out and identify the household, who they will talk to, how they will sell this idea. If you're doing observational research, then your sample becomes the sites. So maybe with the shebeens, you don't just want to map the shebeens and look at what they sell, etc. You might want to do an observation of what happens over a weekend, just to see who comes and buys, whether they only get alcohol or whether somebody's selling tick or another substance on the venue. Discovered in some of the venues where they had bouncers, that the bouncers would be selling tick on the door. So you'd have another different set of clientele that would come to the door to buy drugs, those that came in. So these are kinds of things that, so you might then gain with in diarrheal research. You don't want to do an entire bush area around Delft, so you might map out certain areas and just go and do fecal counts in 10-meter square areas in the bush around the community, just as a way of setting a sample and setting a process. These are all fairly complex notions, and you just need to make sure that you'd be able to take the community along with you. Because it's one thing to explain to get people to agree, but the more people just agree to keep you happy, the more likely it is that the thing will be undermined. Particularly if it gets to the point of, oh God, I've got to traipse all the way over there to that other block. I'm just going to do it over here. Because there's no sense of why it is important. So you need to make sure that those doing the field work and those working with you understand at some basic level as to what's going on and why it is important. Be aware that of the CBPR approach, that even with surveys and qualitative research, might not be possible to set exactly in advance. So particularly if you're writing this kind of thing, and then as you enter the field, so additional contextual issues and so a different community rep comes up and raises particular issues. Because within the CBPR approaches is this need to be constantly adaptive. So you might then need to start adapting your process again as we're going through. Some CBPR approaches do not work on sample size, workshop exercises and mapping. All of these issues depend. But also just remember with the mapping that your samples, your maps might be an issue of sampling, but who you get to collect that information. If you send older women out and younger men out, you might get a completely different set of assets and risks, just because of who they are, what they're aware of, what they see in the community. With older women, you might get a list of churches and police stations and schools as being the assets. With the youth go out, it might be game shops, sports fields, local musicians' house, that might then, or club, that might be the assets. So you need to be aware of who's collecting that information. So the sampling is also at that level. But in the and where it's happened, just to talk in detail about Yeah, and when you work in workshops, who contributed, how they were represented. Yeah, okay. The next step is just to define what research instruments you'll require. Survey questionnaires, discussion schedule for interviews and focus groups, diaries and systems for notes. Sets of instruments required for the specific CBPR approaches. Each of these needs to be described very clearly and very well, and bear in mind that this is partly academic and mostly community-based work. And particularly the CBPR approaches, any instrumentation that's required for that needs particularly to be well described. I know some of it, like the use of stickies, is fairly self-evident, but part of that is a description of the of the tool. Sets of instructions and practice descriptions, observation schedules for options such as positive deviance, any equipment required, audio recorders, cameras, videos, and often lots of paper. CBPR seems particularly unkind in trees. You go through a lot of this kind of newsprint. Again, make sure that these descriptions are in detail. Make sure the instruments match the objectives. And there's often a tendency with particularly a survey to add tools and issues in for interest's sake. Because you're doing this investigation, it needs to reflect back again to your objectives. And the community is often a very good limit on that, because they don't want to be spending an hour at each household on distributing a survey that could be done in 15 minutes. Each of the instruments must be motivated for and must match the research design. And the good rule of thumb is you must not go beyond the objectives, but all the objectives must be covered. So good matching very often is to say, you know, this instrument will relate to this methodology, which relates to this objective. It doesn't necessarily have to be mentally formulated in the proposal, although very often your methods, your design, you know, say objective one will be covered by the survey will respond to objective one, the qualitative methods and interviews are objective two. The CBPR approaches will respond to objectives 3 and 4. So again, these need to be paired in that kind of way. And they can be adapted over time, but initial ideas must be presented. And it depends a lot on your approach. And if you're doing survey work, you can't really keep adapting your instrument. Oh, sorry. Slide got in there twice. Okay, analysis. Make sure there's a description of your analysis process. To include the preparation of the documents for analysis. Includes the transcription, translation where necessary for qualitative interviews, the organization of the workshop data, how one is going to pull together. Because very often a workshop ends up with masses of pages of newsprint. And I've never personally had to try and analyze all of this, but I know people have had nightmares about it. of how to pull together the piece of news. But how the data capture is going to happen. Data capture is a very sophisticated task. It's a difficult task. So you need to make sure that that happens as well as possible. And I'll talk later about the use of, I think it's today, I think tomorrow is the use of information technology in community work and how this can help a lot of issues all the way through. It needs to summarize all stages of the analytic process and for all the methodologies. And validity and reliability and being clear in dealing with your bias. I'm not going to go into detail on the analytic processes. I think when I spoke, I was talking about survey research and qualitative research. Those need to be covered in their own courses. And I think I spoke a little bit about the analytic process of the CBPR specific approaches when we were talking about them in the last block. So I'm not going to talk about it in much depth in this lecture. Ethics, be very clear on the ethical procedures that are required of all ethical aspects of the project. Key issues include consent letters or consent process for methods. And consent is sometimes a more complicated issue in community work as well. Because if you have somebody coming from a research committee which is representative of the civic, it might be harder to refuse consent if someone doesn't want to talk about an issue. So this is something that has to be dealt with quite delicately within the committee. I remember during the bad old days of apartheid, we went to Crossroads. There was a million signatures campaign. All of you are probably much too young. It was a campaign within a period to try and collect 1 million signatures around the country against apartheid. And we went into Crossroads with a group of people, a group of UDF activists. And the head of the, all intent on collecting as many signatures as possible, and the head of the Crossroads Civic stood up and said, you have our protection and our blessing to go to every household. When you get to households, you've got to tell them I told them to sign. Crossroads people must know what they know their duty. Which kind of defeated the point. This was meant to be a free decision made by every person. So it's that kind of ethos that's one you've got to be very careful of in community-based. Because not everybody will be supportive of the civic. Not everybody will be supportive of the processes. You've got to be very careful around consent. And the potential for people to feel excluded from the community. If somebody goes into a household and they do refuse, this field worker comes back and says, yeah, that household was problematic. They refused to sign this. And then that household then faces a threat from the broader community because they didn't assist or didn't participate. So consent is a particular issue you've got to deal with. You have to work with very sensitively. It's not a good, the one option is obviously to bring in people outside the community to do the field work, but that then breaks down many of the notions of the CBPR approach. For qualitative research, you need special mention of the recording of the interview. And again, there are consent issues, because if you're dealing now with, say, an interview with a youth around substance abuse, and he or she's got a particular issue around substance abuse, they might not want to talk about it. Or they might feel that they would be compromised if they spoke about their particular substance abuse. So all of these are, it's just areas that one has to be particularly careful about in working in community issues, and one needs to talk about it within the ethics. The additional concerns with children. Normally your biggest concern with children is getting parental consent. Within a CBPR approach, that is often made easier because of your constant presence in the community. But yeah, I just need to be aware that of the rights of children to assent to the process as well. And at what age a child is actually able to give assent. It's very difficult to work with children under 8 and talk about assent, because they tend to just do whatever their parents tell them, particularly in face of an external. Confidentiality protections, as we spoke about in the earlier lecture, are a particular issue, and you need to be aware and state very clearly in your ethics what you can do in terms of confidentiality and what you can't do. Certainly with the survey data, you have to make sure that your field workers remain confidential, but unless you do some self-completed instruments that are then sealed. But then, and then with qualitative data, certainly, because everybody knows everybody, people know most people in the community will know who's been interviewed. So it's often much harder to give confidentiality. Protection of data, one work in a community setting, one might work in a community hall. How is that data going to be locked up and protected? And then referral plans if specific problems do arise. If it arises that a woman is being abused from during an interview, what referral plan and what protection can you provide to her? What protection can you offer her given that she's part of it and her husband is part of this community or partner is part of this community? Referrals for substance abuse, etc. A lot of these are particular issues for every form of research, but they do take on a particular slant within CBPR. And I do urge that everybody goes back to that lecture on ethics to look at what the core issues are. There's a risk of this potential break of confidentiality. One of the issues with CPR is that methods adapt over time. Now, ethics committees are normally flexible to this, and I had having a discussion with the head of HREC, Nicola, that she said processes are adaptive, but what if there's some material change in the research process, so adding new questions, adding new strategies, adding new instrumentation, then one needs to go back. Within the workshop, saying that you will use this range of techniques, that it gives you the space to be able to talk about and be able to use a lot of different techniques. But you need to just state up front the broad parameters and risks, and state that you'll go back to the ethics committee if real changes occur or if ethical concerns arise in the field. As we've spoken about in the CBPR approach, protocol can be a living document. It can be adapted as you identify new questions, or as you identify clear answers to some questions and want to focus on specific new issues. So the issue of diarrhea, as you answer the question around, if the issue of the water quality becomes clear quite early on that the water quality is generally good, then you need to focus on different issues. How the water is then stored within the household might become the adapted question. It might be that the water bottle that's used to collect the water has never actually been cleaned out with any detergent in a couple of years, or that the cooking pot is actually used for washing clothes and other things as well, which might mean that there's different levels, or it might be used that pot is also used to go and collect food from the garden, so mud enters the pot that might also present a risk. So all of these issues, so as one question is also new questions might arise. And this does become because you're working directly with your intervention community, and because you're in this constant action research cycle, and there might be multiple spirals operating at once, you're constantly having to adapt. And sorry, my nose is really irritated for some reason. The new target groups might also be identified. As the one is going through. So it might just be that, within the diarrheal research, it might be that the focus is on young children, but actually the focus needs to be on the new mothers who haven't yet adapted to learning the techniques of keeping their children safe. So they need to be paired with older women who have been more used to and have established systems of protecting their children. Again, if there's substantial changes, you need to go back to the ethics committee. We're uncertain, rather err on the side of caution. It also might be that you might want to go back not just to your ethics committee, but to other people that spoke about the proposal. It might be if you're working within the community, you might be working with a civic structure that okays the proposal. And then there's a research committee that you're doing active work with. Now, if in the research committee you find that the protocol is adapted to a certain degree, that it is different, you might feel the need to go back to the civic structure to get that committee, to get that new get the new aspects of the proposal cleared. The essentials overall is that CBPR must remain science. It must remain rigorous research. Even if it's not what everybody considers science. There's a lot of people out there who would not consider what we do as science. Would not consider a SWOT analysis as having any real research value, or community mapping as having validity. And these are, but we need to hold on to this, that it is. And we make it science by being systematic, by being rigorous, by dealing with bias quite explicitly. And inevitably within CBPR work, there's a lot of subjectivity and bias because you're working with vested interests. You're not working with a neutral context. You need to make sure documentation of everything is done. So documentation of workshops, documentation of changes, motivations for decisions, the lessons learned, and I think goes back to the notion we talked about earlier with the diaries. And that could be a very useful way of just keeping, but also just a research record of meetings, a formal record of meetings, a formal record of decisions being made, kind of the standard of committee structure and planning. So it might just be that a good minute secretary is essential. And you're looking at process measures as well as impact. And a lot of CBPR is split between this. So in a lot of general researches focuses on impact. In CBPR we're a lot more interested in also the process measures. So not just whether an intervention, and this is also at the intervention level, not just interested about whether intervention makes a difference, whether this intervention, even if it is wonderfully powerful, is actually acceptable by the community. It must also be acceptable by the community. Doing community work is not an excuse for doing bad science. But remember, the definition of good science may be different across context and practitioner.